Some mornings the sunlight fell across the porch of Boone Ranch only to throw the emptiness inside into sharper relief. Garrett Boone, 35, woke as he always did. Silent, deliberate, each movement measured, as if his life had been reduced to a ledger of tasks to be checked off. Coffee bubbled in a blackened pot, its bitter steam mixing with the faint tang of smoke from last night's embers. He sat alone in the wooden chair by the window, staring through the fogged glass at a pasture still veiled in morning haze. No one sat across from him. No quiet greeting stirred the kitchen. Only the hiss of boiling coffee and the scratch of a match against a spent box to light the first cigarette of the day. Celeste had once been the light in his world. She left on a winter morning when the wind cut like knives, dropping a wrinkled note and the engagement ring he had slipped on her finger. I need the world, not a ranch to bury me alive. He had read those words until the creases tore, until the letters blurred. They hardened him into stone that breathed, alive, but without expectation for anything beyond another day passing. In Santa Fe Crossing, people whispered Garrett's name with unease. Men tipped their hats, but none invited him to share a drink. Children stilled their laughter when he passed, watching him as though he carried a shadow they wanted no part of. Some claimed he was dangerous. Others said he was cold. One night in the saloon, a half-drunk ranch hand muttered into his glass, "Boone, that man ain't got a heart." The truth was different. Garrett had a heart, but it had long since been shattered. He was not cruel, only emptied of courage to hope. His days ran like clockwork, up before dawn, saddling Rosie, his bay mare, to ride the fence line. He checked each post, tightened every strand of wire, swung the hammer until his arms ached. At noon he spooned beans from a pot, then worked until the light sank low. Evenings, he smoked on the porch, cigarette after cigarette, until the bottle inside called him. Whiskey never ran dry, but neither did he drain it. He drank only enough to sleep, never enough to forget. Pain could not be forgotten. It clung like the smell of ash on old wood. The house mirrored his solitude. 2 rooms and a kitchen. A bed made square as a soldier's bunk, a blanket folded neat, dishes scrubbed and stacked. Everything in order, save for the memories he refused to disturb. On occasion, Roger Avery, the neighbor from 2 miles down, rode over. Garrett poured him coffee, then sat back, listening without offering much in return. Roger filled the air with town gossip, the weather, whose cattle had strayed, who married, who ran off. Garrett answered in single beats. Yeah, I know. Maybe. Roger once shook his head, tamping his pipe against the porch rail. You're still young, Boone. Live like a 70-year-old, and you'll die half a man before they bury you. Garrett only drew on his cigarette, letting smoke blur his gaze. News still crept into his closed life, through Roger, through Dr. Bond, through whispers in the saloon. And lately, a new name had begun to surface. Ruth Ann Moore. Word was she'd come from far-off St. Louis with her mother's home, taking work at Brian Sawyer's general store. Together they swept out years of dust and clutter, setting shelves in order, putting shine back into a place long neglected. Folks said her mother was stern, but the daughter carried a quiet grace, a deft hand, a smile that softened even strangers. Some marveled. That store feels new again because of those 2 women. Others scoffed behind cupped hands. Colored women won't last in this town. Garrett heard it, let it roll off. He'd sworn never again to notice a woman, never again to let himself be fooled by brightness in a smile. Once burned, twice buried. Yet, on a dusk when he sat with cigarette in hand, Roger's words returned unbidden. That girl, Ruth Ann, she's got eyes that could hush a saloon full of men. Garrett felt his chest thud in an unfamiliar rhythm. He gave a low, bitter laugh and ground out the smoke. Don't be a fool, Boone. Eyes can't stitch up a broken heart. That night, moonlight spilled cold across the wooden floor. Garrett lay flat, staring at the rafters, the silence pressing down. The old ache gnawed as always, but within it, for the first time in years, something stirred. A thin crack of light, faint but real. It bore no name he could yet claim, only the thought of a woman he had never met. A stranger whose presence he felt before ever seeing her face. Santa Fe Crossing was a town that thrived on sameness. Weathered faces filled its streets, roofs bleached pale by the relentless western sun. So when Ruth Ann Moore and her mother arrived, it felt as if a strange wind had blown in, unsettling the dust that had long settled over the place. Ruth Ann was 25, slender yet straight-shouldered, her dark eyes carrying sorrow without surrendering to despair. In St. Louis, she had buried a husband taken too young by fever. Time, they said, would heal, but time had only etched the memories deeper, sharper. With no ties left, she chose the road west beside her mother, carrying little more than a few wooden trunks, a weathered guitar, and a will to carve a place for herself in unforgiving country. They found work at Brian Sawyer's general store. Sawyer was past 60, his back bent, his hands too stiff to tame the cluttered stockroom. Within a week, Ruth Ann and her mother transformed the neglected space. Shelves wiped clean shone in lamplight. Glass jars of penny candy lined up straight. Sacks of flour, sugar, and salt stacked neat as fence rails. The store breathed again. Customers paused at the door, surprised at the order restored. Many noticed Ruth Ann behind the counter, her plain brown dress, her hands swift as she weighed beans or tied up parcels. She smiled at each of them, not wide, not careless, but steady, like a lantern flame that held firm against the wind. Word spread quickly. A black widow in town. With gossip came judgment. Some praised her gentle eyes, others scoffed, whispering that women like her would not last long in such a place. Ruth Ann heard it all. She kept smiling, kept arranging goods, kept pulling a chair forward when her mother's legs trembled. She had learned that survival meant not fleeing shadows, but standing upright within them. One morning, Garrett Boone walked through the store's door. The hinges groaned, and conversation outside seemed to die with the sound. He filled the frame, tall, broad-shouldered, his gray shirt dusted from the range. Sunlight slanted across his sharp features, over eyes the town had learned to avoid. Cold eyes, they said. Ruth Ann was stacking jars of beans when she looked up. Their gazes caught. His eyes were ice after a long winter, unflinching, unforgiving. Yet she did not flinch. For a breath, she held the look, not defiant, but unafraid. Garrett strode to the counter. From his pocket he drew a folded slip of paper and slid it across the scarred wood. His fingertip brushed hers as he did. The touch was brief, but to him it was startling. An unfamiliar flicker of warmth he had not allowed himself to feel in years. Ruth Ann unfolded the note. Nails, salt, tobacco, coffee. Her voice was quiet yet firm. You'll be needing all of this today? Garrett gave a curt nod, nothing more. He was a man of few words, wrapping silence around himself like armor. Within minutes, she had gathered the items, laying them out with tidy precision. Her mother stepped forward from the back, her gaze cautious, weighing the man she had heard so much about. Garrett felt the weight of her scrutiny, but gave no answer to it. He counted out coins, slid them across the counter, and turned to leave. When the door shut behind him, Ruth Ann lingered at the counter. Her fingers traced the grain of the wood where his hand had passed. In that fleeting contact, she had sensed contradiction. The town called him stone-hearted, yet his hand had trembled like a man unpracticed in warmth. That afternoon, sweeping the store floor, she spotted a pencil left near the counter. Likely his, forgotten when he wrote the list. She turned it in her fingers, wondering if even men who wrapped themselves in silence could leave behind small traces of themselves. Perhaps Garrett Boone was not the unyielding figure carved by rumor. Her past had taught her a truth she held fast to. Pain was not an ending. It was proof that love had once lived, that loss had been real, and that one could still choose to keep going. That night, Ruth Ann sat at the window of their rented room. She strummed a few chords on her old guitar, letting the sound drift into the prairie night. Her mother, sewing nearby, looked up. "Are you certain this is where you want to stay?" Ruth Ann answered with a low, steady smile. "I'm tired of running, Mama. It's time I stood still." And somewhere beyond the town, Garrett Boone sat on his porch, a cigarette ember glowing between his fingers. His mind returned unbidden to the brush of her hand in the store that morning. He told himself it was nothing, that he would forget. Yet his heart, against reason, had already marked it. Every morning it was the same. Sunlight crested the eastern ridges, stretching long shadows over Boone Ranch. And there he was again, Garrett Boone astride his mare, riding the fence line like a ghost repeating itself. He checked posts, herded cattle, patched wire. His body moved with habit, but his mind had begun to wander. More and more amid the rhythm of hooves, he found himself remembering Ruth Ann Moore's eyes. Eyes that had met his in the store without flinching, steady and unafraid. One wind-whipped afternoon, Roger Avery rode over. Twice widowed, with a pipe always clenched in his teeth, Roger was one of the few who still visited Boone. He sat at the kitchen table, tamping tobacco, his weathered face creased in patience before he finally spoke. "Boone, you can't keep living like a walking corpse. I saw how you looked at that Moore girl. Don't bother denying it. A man's eyes don't lie." Garrett drew on his cigarette, smoke spilling into the silence like a curtain. He offered no answer, only tapped a slow rhythm on the table with his fingers. Yet Roger's words fell into him like stones into a still pond, ripples spreading further than he cared to admit. The next day, Dr. Bond arrived with his leather bag and a small bottle of whiskey. He checked a cut across Garrett's palm, the kind left by barbed wire, and spoke plain. "You're strong enough, Boone. Strength isn't what you lack. It's trust. Life's too short to spend it locked behind walls you built yourself." Garrett let out a dry laugh, brittle as old timber. "Open my heart just to be left again? No, I've learned that lesson." The doctor didn't argue further, but the words lingered long after he left. That night, Garrett lay on his rigid bed, staring at the ceiling. He remembered again that fleeting brush of Ruth Ann's hand in the store. He remembered her smile, not the nervous smile of town girls, but the quiet smile of someone who had known loss and chosen to keep living. It unsettled him that such a smile could weaken the wall he had so carefully mortared with silence. A week later, he returned to Sawyer's store. This time he carried a basket of fresh eggs, setting it down on the counter. Ruth Ann looked up, her eyes catching his. "Would you like flour or sugar for these?" she asked, her tone calm, steady. "Sugar," he answered, his voice clipped, but his gaze lingering a heartbeat longer. It became habit. Each week, Garrett brought eggs. Each week, Ruth Ann met him with a small question that chipped at his defenses. "How are the cattle this week? Do you ever ride up north past the ridges? Do you take your coffee black or with sugar?" They were simple questions, ordinary as pebbles, but they echoed inside him long after he rode away. One day, when she passed the bag of sugar across the counter, her fingers brushed against his wrist. Garrett stiffened, but didn't pull back. For a breath, warmth passed between them. He rode home in silence, the weight of that moment pressing on him more than any load of timber. Roger caught him later, squinting with a half smile. "You trading eggs, Boone, or trading pieces of your heart?" Garrett only grunted, but beneath the beard his skin flushed hot. The town began to notice. Folks whispered about why the man who once avoided the store now visited every week without fail. Suspicion buzzed like flies, but Ruth Ann bore it with her steady grace. She met him always the same way, with even eyes, with a smile that neither fawned nor faltered. That, more than anything, unsettled Garrett. She wasn't afraid of him, nor was she trying to win him. She simply saw him as a man, no more, no less. And that was dangerous, because it cracked the wall he had hidden behind for so long. One night, after setting the egg basket on his kitchen table, Garrett sat in the glow of a lantern. The flame threw his shadow high across the wood-paneled wall. He stared into it, and in the darkness he thought he saw her eyes, firm, gentle, refusing to yield. For the first time in years, he admitted to himself what he had not dared before. Maybe, just maybe, he wasn't entirely dead inside the shadows. Garrett Boone never thought a basket of eggs could become the thing he looked forward to most in a week. Yet lately, each morning when he passed the chicken coop, he studied every shell as though they carried some hidden weight. Smooth, uncracked, rounded, he chose carefully, setting each into a straw-lined basket, then leaving it in the corner of his kitchen. It was no longer a chore. It was an excuse, a reason to step into Sawyer's store, to meet the eyes he could not shake from his thoughts. Work on the ranch went on as it always had, checking fences, driving cattle, hammering posts, mending stalls. But between the thud of wood and the clang of nails, Ruth Ann Moore's face slid into his mind like a cloud drifting across sunlit sky. Her dark, steady eyes, her voice soft but clear, that first brief touch across the counter. All of it returned, and his heart, long thought dead, skipped into uneven rhythm. One afternoon, riding Rosie into town, he felt the strange nerves of a young man courting for the first time. He cursed himself for a fool, yet brushed dust from his shirt, straightened his hat, and stepped through the door. The hinges creaked. Ruth Ann lifted her head from stacking flour sacks. Their eyes met, just for a heartbeat, but enough to draw his chest tight. She smiled, not coy, not hesitant, but with the calm ease of someone greeting a familiar guest. "More eggs today?" she asked, her voice warm as she reached for the basket. Her fingers brushed his again. Not fleeting this time, but holding for the span of a breath. A charge ran up his spine, and he pulled back sharply, feigning to smooth his coat. His eyes betrayed him, though, brightening then shuddering as quick as a strike of flint. Ruth Ann noticed, and the corner of her mouth lifted slightly, as if tucking away a secret she alone would keep. Garrett lingered, watching the way she moved behind the counter. The tilt of her head as she counted, the fall of black hair across her shoulder, the sure way her hands tied the string on a sack of sugar. Details he never noticed in anyone else now carved themselves deep into memory, clinging tighter than the smoke he breathed each night. Soon, Santa Fe Crossing began to talk. It always did. First, it was murmurs in the saloon, Boone showing up every week, when once he'd hardly stepped into town. Then it spread into sharp whispers along the boardwalk. The coldest man in the county trading eggs with the colored widow. Some shrugged. If they're happy, who cares? Others sneered. Garrett Boone lowering himself, and for a black woman. Gossip grew like weeds, untended yet thriving. Garrett heard it. He was no fool nor deaf to the town's sting, but he didn't fight the talk. He let it roll, and each week he returned, basket in hand, to see Ruth Ann's steady smile. Sometimes he asked himself whether he was trading eggs for goods, or for the brief closeness that came with it. One afternoon, as she slid a sack of sugar across, Ruth Ann's eyes lingered on him. "These eggs are fine ones today. You take care with them, don't you?" Caught off guard, he muttered, "I only pick the best." It was a small reply, but inside it stretched taut like a wire. For the truth was, he cared for the eggs because of her, because of the spark in her gaze when she took them from his hands. Stepping out onto the store's porch, sack in hand, he heard the voices plain behind him. "See? I told you." Boone's set on the Moore girl. Then a high laugh cut through. "Mark my words, he'll regret it soon enough." Garrett tugged his hat lower and walked past without a word. But inside, a flame steadied. He was done running from rumor. That night, sitting on the ranch porch, cigarette glowing between his fingers, the smoke rose in thin spirals. In its haze, he saw her face, her calm smile. He remembered Roger's voice. "You can't live like a corpse forever." He remembered Dr. Bond's warning. "What you lack is trust." And for the first time, Garrett allowed himself to wonder if they were right. Perhaps, just perhaps, he had begun to trust again. Not in the world at large, not in promises of forever, but in one woman's eyes, and in the quiet certainty of her smile. In Santa Fe Crossing, everyone knew Sawyer's store had been reborn under the hands of Ruth Ann Moore and her mother. The once dusty shelves now stood straight and orderly, white sacks of flour stacked neat as fence posts, glass jars of candy catching the eyes of every child who pressed their noses to the window. Yet with each passing week, more customers filled the narrow room, and the space groaned with the weight of its own success. One Saturday morning, Ruth Ann laid a cloth across the counter, wiping sweat from her brow. She glanced at her mother. "Mama, if we open up the west wall, folks will move easier through the store. We could add another row of shelves." Ruby Moore studied her daughter, pride tugging one corner of her mouth, worry the other. "You dream too far, child. Who'll raise walls, saw timber? You and I ain't men." Her words carried truth. Expansion meant muscle and skill neither woman possessed. And somehow, as word traveled in the small town, it reached Garrett Boone. That afternoon, Ruth Ann was shifting flour barrels when the door creaked open. The tall figure filled the doorway, broad shoulders, dust still clinging to his gray shirt. He carried no basket of eggs, no list of supplies. He simply pulled off his gloves and spoke in his low, steady way. "I heard you're building an addition. I'll help." Ruth Ann froze, words caught in her throat. Ruby stepped forward, eyes sharp as drawn steel. "Mr. Boone, we don't need burden from anyone. This is family work." Garrett lifted his gaze, meeting hers without flinching. "It's not a burden. It's what I can do." His voice held no plea, only certainty. Ruby's lips pressed thin, but Ruth Ann placed a gentle hand on her mother's arm. "Mama, let him. We can't do it alone." So the next morning, Garrett arrived with a saw, a hammer, and planks of clean, straight timber. Sunlight cut across the dusty street, glinting on his shoulders as he set tools in place. Townsfolk slowed to stare. Some whistled low, some smirked. Boone helping colored women raise walls? But Garrett paid no mind. Work began. He measured each board, swung the hammer with practiced strength. Ruth Ann stood nearby, steadying planks, her hands brushing sawdust from her skirts. The scent of raw wood mingled with sweat, filling the air. Silence mixed with the sharp rhythm of nails striking home, the cadence of a strange and wordless music. Once, as Ruth Ann bent to pick up a box of nails, her hand touched his at the same moment. The contact startled them both. Garrett cleared his throat and drew back, but Ruth Ann's lips curved ever so slightly, a secret folded into the moment. By late afternoon, a section of wall stood upright, shadow stretching across the street. Ruth Ann climbed a stool to brace a crossbeam. The stool wobbled, old legs buckling. In a blink, she pitched backward. Garrett lunged, arms locking around her waist, hauling her tight against his chest. Her breath caught. Their faces hovered close, the heat of his skin mixing with the scent of wood, sweat, and tobacco. In his eyes, she saw something raw, long-buried hunger and confusion breaking loose. His voice rumbled low near her ear. "Careful." "Thank you," she whispered, trying for calm though color rushed to her cheeks. His arms held her one heartbeat longer than need demanded before letting go. The rest of the afternoon blurred. Ruth Ann worked on, but her pulse stuttered with every memory of that brief hold. Each glance at Garrett, his jaw set as sweat traced along it, his hands gripping the hammer, struck chords she tried to still. From the window, Ruby Moore watched. She saw the way her daughter's gaze lingered, the way Boone's hand brushed a moment too long when passing a tool. A mother's wariness kindled in her chest, fire quick and fierce. When dusk fell, she drew Ruth Ann aside. "Child, remember this. Boone is not a man to place your trust in easy. He's been left before. His heart's hard as stone. Don't let yourself be the next to break against it." Ruth Ann squeezed her mother's hand, her tone soft yet sure. "Mama, I know, but I've lost too, and I won't live my life bowed by fear." That night, after the store was shuttered, Ruth Ann stepped outside. She caught a glimpse of Garrett riding Rosie down the road, his frame lit silver by the moon. The sight warmed something deep inside her, a spark that felt less like scandal and more like a fire worth tending. Back at Boone Ranch, Garrett washed his hands in the cold basin, then lifted his head to the mirror. For the first time in years, the eyes staring back weren't hollow. There was a light, strange, unfamiliar, born of the moment he caught her as she fell. He knew then. The wall he had built stone by stone around his heart was under siege. and the fire burning through it came not from anger, but from a woman he had never dared to imagine walking into his life. Early winter crept into Santa Fe Crossing on a strange, damp wind. Roof lines shivered under gray clouds. With her mother visiting kin in the next town, Ruth Ann Moore ran the store alone. The absence stretched the days, filled them with work, and left a silence no one else could fill. During that week, Garrett Boone stopped by more often. At first he used excuses, checking the new wall, asking if she needed more nails or timber. But Ruth Ann knew. She didn't push him away. Even wordless, his presence steadied the empty room. On Thursday afternoon, dark clouds bunched like fists over the street. Wind rattled the awnings. A loose board groaned on the porch, ready to tear free. Ruth Ann was trying to brace it when Garrett appeared. He said nothing, just rolled up his sleeves and climbed the stool, hammer in hand. "You don't have to," she began. "If I don't, the wind'll take the whole thing tonight," he cut in, voice low. Rain broke suddenly, fat drops drumming on the tin roof, splashing mud from the street. Ruth Ann watched his shoulders darken under the storm. She opened the door. "Come inside. I've coffee on." He hesitated, then stepped in. The door shut behind them, sealing out the gusts. Inside, only their breaths and the smell of brewing coffee filled the small room. Ruth Ann set the black pot on the coal stove, poured 2 enamel cups. When she passed one to him, their fingers touched and didn't flinch apart. Garrett sat on a wooden chair, heat from the cup seeping into his palms, but not yet into his chest. Ruth Ann sat opposite, quiet for a moment, before she spoke softly. "Do you ever think that losing someone means you'll never truly laugh again?" He lifted his gaze, dark eyes weighted. She held it, her own eyes steady. "My husband died young. Fever took him before we could build a future. I spent months blaming, months screaming. In the end, I left, not to forget, but to learn how to breathe again." The rain thickened, a curtain over her words. Garrett set his cup down, fingers trembling. His voice rasped like gravel. "Celeste, she left me. Not dead, just gone. Left a note and a ring. I thought I died that day too." Ruth Ann tilted her head, and in her eyes there was no pity, only a deep knowing. "Yet you're still here, still fixing roofs, still keeping eggs clean. You're not dead, Garrett. You're just afraid to live again." Silence stretched. Rain fell. Hearts beat heavy. Garrett rubbed his hand over his face, then let it drop. When he looked up, the void in his eyes flickered with a fragile light, something wanting to escape. Ruth Ann rose and laid her hand on the back of his. His was rough, hardened by years of sun and work. He stared at her small hand, then at her face. In her gaze he saw an invitation without words, a chance to believe again. He closed his fingers gently over hers. Slowly, as though afraid to shatter something delicate, he leaned forward until his mouth found hers. The kiss was not fierce, not hurried. It was a whisper, 2 people telling each other they could still be found. Ruth Ann trembled but didn't pull away. Her heart drummed, chest against his. Garrett drew her closer, his arm around her back, holding her as if to prove she was real and would not vanish when he woke. Outside, rain poured. Inside, they let go of fear, warmth rising between them. Damp clothes gave way to skin against skin, every old wound soothed by shared breath, by soft sounds that were less desire than confession. That winter night, they gave each other more than closeness. They gave a beginning, a quiet healing without vows, only presence. When the rain eased and the moon slipped behind clouds, Garrett lay beside Ruth Ann on the narrow bed. He brushed a wet strand of hair from her cheek. Eyes closed, she whispered, "Thank you for staying." His reply was low, like wind at winter's end. "Thank you for making me want to live again." Santa Fe Crossing was the kind of place where small tales swelled like sparks in a dry field. Within days of that stormy night, whispers stirred. At first it was only a few women at the market, remarking how Garrett Boone had been seen entering Sawyer's store after dark, and no one recalled seeing him leave. By midweek, the story had grown. He stayed the night. By week's end, his name and Ruth Ann Moore's were spoken in the same breath, stitched together by gossip. Some chuckled, calling it fate's cruel joke, that the coldest cowboy in the county should be tied to a black widow. Others shrugged with a softer note. Maybe even Boone needs a home like the rest of us. But many more carried looks half pity, half scorn, their stares pressing down hardest on Ruth Ann. At the saloon, men leaned over their mugs, their voices sharp with contempt. "Boone's gone mad. With all the white girls in Santa Fe Crossing, he circles around a colored widow?" Another spat tobacco into the sawdust. "It's his right to choose. Maybe she's got something he needs." Their laughter was edged with derision. Word soon reached Ruby Moore, her brow furrowed deep as plow ruts. "Child, be careful," she warned her daughter. "This town never took kindly to folks who step outside its line." Ruth Ann's only answer was a sad smile, her eyes burning with quiet resolve. Garrett heard his share from Roger Avery. The old neighbor tightened his cinch one afternoon and muttered, "They're talking about you and Ruth Ann. Nasty talk, but no surprise. What'll you do about it?" Garrett struck a match, lit his cigarette, smoke curling around his worn face. His reply was low, even. "This time, I won't run." Sunday dawned cold and brittle, sunlight drizzling thin gold over wooden rooftops. The church bell tolled, pulling townsfolk from their homes. Ruth Ann dressed in a deep blue gown, a wool shawl draped across her shoulders, her bearing humble yet steady. Garrett arrived first, boots polished, shirt clean, his features still harsh, but his eyes carrying a new light. A hush rippled as he stepped toward her on the church steps. Murmurs rose like wind squeezing through shutters. Ruth Ann faltered for half a breath. Then Garrett held out his hand. For a moment, all sound dropped. Then, with a calm that silenced her own doubts, Ruth Ann set her hand in his. His sun-browned grip closed firm around her slender fingers. Together they walked into the church, not dodging a single stare. Before the rows of pews, beneath the wooden cross, Garrett kept her hand in his, steady as a vow. The town nearly held its breath. Some eyes softened in quiet acceptance, a nod here and there. Others narrowed, lips pressed thin in disapproval. But to Garrett, it was all a blur. He saw only Ruth Ann's shoulders trembling slightly, and he tightened his hold, his silent promise. "I'm here. With you." Throughout the service, no one spoke outright, but the whispers rose and fell like surf against a shore. Ruth Ann sat straight-backed, eyes fixed ahead. Garrett sat beside her, never releasing her hand. Children twisted in their seats to gawk. Older women snapped their fans harder. Yet there were also tender glances from those who knew loss, who understood the sting of gossip. When the service ended and the congregation poured outside, voices swelled again. Daniela Jacobs murmured, "Well, at least she carries herself with grace. Perhaps Boone knows his own mind." An old man snorted, "It won't fit. This world doesn't forgive easy." Garrett ignored them all. He led Ruth Ann down the steps, hand still firmly around hers. A sharp gust caught Ruth Ann's shawl, flipping it free. Without pause, Garrett reached to settle it back over her shoulders. The gesture was simple, but it drew every watching eye. Whispers rose higher, but Ruth Ann smiled, a smile unhidden, clear as sunrise. That night at Boone Ranch, Garrett sat on the porch with a half-burned cigarette. He replayed the morning in his mind, the bell's toll, the light streaming through stained glass, Ruth Ann's hand inside his own. For the first time in 5 long years, the emptiness in his chest no longer echoed. Whatever the town might say, his choice was made. Since that Sunday at the church, Santa Fe Crossing buzzed without pause. Every time Ruth Ann stepped into the street, some faces softened, nodding with quiet respect, while others turned sharp, cutting into her back like blades. Garrett Boone had believed he was ready to bear the talk, that the clasp of her hand in his was a promise he could hold steady. But in the stillness of his ranch kitchen, with smoke curling above the stove, old memories bled back, tearing open scars thought long shut. Celeste. The name cut him even now. He remembered the morning she walked away, the ring left on the table, the note scribbled without explanation, the door shutting like a cleaver through his chest. Garrett had collapsed on the wooden floor that day, swearing no woman would ever be given the chance to touch his weak places again. And yet Ruth Ann Moore had done just that, without trying, with nothing more than her eyes, her steady hand. It terrified him. He began to fear that one morning he would wake to find her gone as well, vanished like Celeste. He feared the small faith he had found would only turn to dust. So in the days that followed, Garrett withdrew. He still carried eggs into town, but he set the basket down quick, gave a nod, and turned on his heel. The shelves that needed mending, the crates that needed shifting, he left her to manage. When she tried to draw him into talk, his answers fell blunt, clipped short. Ruth Ann noticed. She was no fool to miss the wall rising between them. But each time she saw the cold edging back into his eyes, her chest ached. She wondered if she had failed him somehow, or if it was her skin, her place in the town's harsh gaze, that he regretted. One afternoon, when he set a basket down and made for the door, Ruth Ann followed fast. She caught his hand, her voice trembling, yet firm. "Garrett." He stopped, shoulders stiff, but would not meet her eyes. "What are you doing?" she pressed. "Why push me away? Why run?" His jaw clenched, his broad shoulders tight as drawn rope. "I'm not running. I'm keeping distance. For both of us." She stepped in front of him, forcing his gaze. "You think I don't see it? You're scared. You think I'll leave like the one before. You think I'll leave you with nothing but that empty house." Her throat caught, but her eyes burned steady. "Garrett, I didn't come here to leave. I already buried one husband. I will not run again." Her words struck like hammer blows against the wall he'd built. Garrett's chest squeezed tight. breath short. He turned, trying to hide. But Ruth Ann held his hand, holding him in place. For the first time in years, tears rose hot in his eyes. He tried to choke them back, but they spilled, burning tracks down his face. His body shook, and the basket slipped from his grasp, eggs breaking against the dirt floor. He covered his face with both hands, shoulders trembling. Ruth Ann said nothing more. She stepped close, wrapped her arms around him. At first he stood stiff, hard as stone, but slowly he bent, his face buried against her shoulder, salt soaking her dress. "I don't know how to trust," he whispered, voice breaking. "I don't know how to keep anyone from leaving." Her hand moved slow across his back, a steady rhythm like a lullaby. "You don't need to keep me. I'm here because I choose to be. I won't walk away just because of what they say." In that moment, Garrett let go. The grief, the years of silence, the weight he had carried alone. He released it, and Ruth Ann did not leave. When at last his shaking eased, he lifted his head. His eyes were raw, rimmed red. Ruth Ann raised her hand and brushed the dampness from his cheek, whispering, "You're not alone anymore." Garrett drew her close again, fierce like a drowning man clutching shore. And for the first time since Celeste's shadow, he believed it might be true. Ruby Moore returned from her visit with kin, weary in step, but sharp in eye. It did not take long for her to hear what the town had made of her daughter's hand held in Garrett Boone's that Sunday past. No longer whispers, the stories threaded through kitchens and porches alike. Boone walked into church hand in hand with the Moore girl. That evening, Ruby sat across from Ruth Ann in their small room, her hands knotted tight. "Daughter, do you know what you're doing? Garrett Boone carries a heart already cracked, and this town, it will not welcome you both with open arms." Ruth Ann's answer was steady. "I know, Mama, but I too have lived loss. I won't choose to live half a life. I choose to stay." Ruby sighed, heavy as the wind before rain. In her chest coiled the same worry. Could Garrett Boone shield her daughter against the weight of scorn and gossip? Garrett knew the doubt that lingered. Roger Avery had told him plain, "If you mean this, speak to her mother. Don't just hold her hand in shadows." So one still afternoon, Garrett saddled Rosie and rode into town. He had shaved, pulled on a clean shirt, brushed dust from his hat. At Ruby's door he knocked. She opened, her gaze sweeping over him like a test. "Mr. Boone," she said, her voice not warm, not cold, only measuring. "Mrs. Moore," he answered, hat in hand, tone firm. "I've come to ask your leave." They sat at the kitchen table, the faint scent of her herbs drifting between them. Garrett laid his hat down, his chest stiff with the weight of his purpose. Ruby met his eyes, her own voice calm but cutting. "You know what they say about you and my daughter?" "I know." "And you think you're strong enough to shield her from it? From scorn that will never cease?" Garrett swallowed, then spoke. "I can't promise to silence every cruel word, but I promise to stand beside her when they come. I can't promise riches. My land yields just enough, but I promise truth and love all my days." Ruby searched his face as though reading scars beneath the skin. "Words sound fine, Boone. Another man once promised her forever, and death, or betrayal, took it away. You sure you won't falter?" Garrett leaned forward, voice ringing with certainty. "I know abandonment. I carry that wound myself, and for that reason, I swear I will never lay it on her." For a long breath, Ruby held him in her gaze. What she saw was not dreams, but the hardness of a man seared and scarred, yet still standing. At last she gave a small nod. "If my daughter agrees, I won't stand in the way. But Boone, do not make me regret believing you." He bowed his head. "Thank you, ma'am." The following Sunday, the bell tolled again across Santa Fe Crossing. After the service, as folks spilled into the yard, Garrett did not leave. He took Ruth Ann's hand and led her into the open space before the crowd. A light wind stirred, rustling dry leaves across the jardin boards. Murmurs rose, then faded as he reached into his pocket and drew out a plain silver ring. No stone, no finery, only a circle shining under the pale sun. Garrett bent to one knee, lifted his chin, and let his words ring clear. "Ruth Ann Moore, I cannot promise wealth, nor a life without hardship. I promise only honesty, love, and that I will never walk away. Will you walk the rest of life with me?" The yard froze. Some covered their mouths. Some frowned. Many stared, breath held. Ruth Ann trembled, her hand shaking in his. Tears welled, but her smile broke radiant. "Yes," she whispered, voice carrying strong. "I will." The air erupted, gasps, scattered claps, rising applause. Disapproval lingered in narrowed eyes, but others softened, recalling their own scars, their own defiant loves. Garrett rose, slid the ring onto her finger, and before them all pressed his lips to hers. No secrecy, no shame, only truth. From the porch, Ruby Moore watched, tears tracing her weathered cheeks. She knew her daughter's road would not be easy, but in Garrett Boone's gaze she saw the one thing she had prayed her daughter might find, an honesty that would not break. That winter came early, biting through coats and cloaking Santa Fe Crossing in a silver-gray hush. Snow had not yet fallen thick, but the cold carried sharp teeth, and every rooftop glistened pale beneath a frost that clung like glass. The town was small, ordinary, but from the day Garrett Boone bent his knee in the churchyard and Ruth Ann Moore answered yes, it seemed to wake from a long sleep. People whispered everywhere, some with surprise, others with scorn. But when the invitations went out, few dared stay away. The wedding of Garrett Boone, once the coldest, loneliest man in the territory, to Ruth Ann Moore, the Black Widow who had journeyed west, became an event Santa Fe Crossing had never seen. That morning the sky stretched clear as polished glass, clouds stacked soft like veils. The little church at the end of Main Street was dressed in pale blue ribbons and wreaths of evergreen. Folks entered hushed, as if stepping into history. Ruby Moore sat in the first pew, her hands clasped tight, eyes bright with tears. She had doubted, even feared, but now, seeing her daughter wrapped in a white shawl she herself had sewn, her chest swelled with pride she could not name. In the side room, Ruth Ann prepared. Her dress was plain ivory, but it shaped to her gentle figure, and her reflection in the cracked mirror revealed not the grieving widow of St. Louis, but a woman remade, ready to begin again. She held a bouquet of winter wildflowers, hardy blooms gathered from the frozen edge of the prairie. Her eyes shone clear, steady. The bell tolled. Doors swung wide. Ruth Ann stepped in, slow and measured, the bouquet tight in her hands. Light filtered through stained glass and wrapped around her like a halo. The congregation held breath. Faces turned, some startled, some softened. some already wet with tears. From the back pew came a whisper. I've never seen Boone smile until today. For there he stood at the front, tall in a simple black suit. The cut did not soften him, yet his face, long carved in ice, now opened with a rare smile, his gaze fixed on her alone, as though the room had emptied. She reached him, and he held out his hand. She placed hers within it. In that clasp, shadows fell away. The minister began, his voice rolling deep and warm. But when Garrett lifted his head to speak, silence deepened until the room seemed to lean in. I once thought myself dead, he said, voice rough but strong. Not by bullet nor beast, but by being left behind. The morning Celeste walked away, I believed my heart shattered past repair. I lived like a husk, a man-shaped shell, with no place left for love, until Ruth Ann Moore. She looked at me, not as a menace, not as a curse, but as a man, and in her eyes, I drew breath again. A stifled sob sounded from the back pew. An old woman dabbed at her cheeks. Roger Avery nodded, his lips pressed tight, as though he too had been forgiven something. Garrett pressed on, voice thick but sure. I cannot promise riches. The land I hold feeds but does not overflow. I cannot promise storms will never come, but I promise to stand with her when they break. I cannot promise the town will always understand, but I promise this. I will never walk away. Never. Ruth Ann's fingers tightened on his hand. Tears spilled, but her smile shone bright. When the minister turned to her, she lifted her chin. I once buried a husband, she said, voice trembling but clear. I thought I would carry widowhood forever. Then came Garrett, a man everyone called cold, cruel even, yet whose hand trembled when it brushed mine. He does not need to keep me. I chose to stay. I stand here not to leave, but to remain. Always. The murmur of the crowd hushed into reverent quiet. Some who had doubted now bowed their heads. When the minister at last declared them husband and wife, Garrett bent and kissed her. Not hidden, not hurried, but a full claim before every watching eye. His hands cradled her face, hers clung to him, and in that kiss lived a vow deeper than words. Applause burst like a flood. Some still frowned, but most rose to their feet, clapping, cheering. Laughter spilled. A wave of sound and light filled the old wooden church. Outside, the first snow of the season began to fall, tiny flakes drifting soft across the churchyard. Garrett and Ruth Ann stepped into it, hand in hand. The town gathered around. For the first time, Garrett Boone was not a man alone. He was a husband, a partner, claimed and claiming in equal measure. Ruby stood at the threshold, tears carving her cheeks, yet her heart eased. My daughter has found her harbor, she whispered. Handfuls of white rice were thrown, caught in the wind, mingling with the snow. Amid it all, Garrett and Ruth Ann laughed. Not a laugh against the world, but with it, welcomed at last into its fold. That night, light spilled from the church windows, casting gold onto the street. Fiddles and voices filled the air, mingling with the clatter of boots and bursts of joy. Children darted between tables. Men clinked glasses. Women hummed along. In the center of it all, Garrett held Ruth Ann close. He was no dancer, heavy-footed and awkward, but he swayed with her, honest and unashamed. She leaned against him, whispering into his ear, "You are no longer alone." And his reply came soft but steadfast, "Never again." After the winter wedding, the stir in Santa Fe Crossing began to cool. People still whispered, still sometimes shook their heads at the thought of a white cowboy choosing a black widow, but the edge of novelty dulled. Curiosity gave way to habit, and in that ordinary rhythm, Garrett Boone and Ruth Ann Moore began a chapter that belonged only to them. Garrett chose to raise a new house, not far from his ranch, yet closer to town, so Ruth Ann could still lend her hand at the store when she wished. Old Roger Avery, stiff in the knees but steady with a carpenter's measure, came to help with the frame. Neighbors brought planks, some lent tools. Not everyone offered blessing with their labor, but many came anyway, drawn by curiosity or a quiet goodwill. They broke ground in early spring, when the snow had barely melted and the soil turned soft under boots. Garrett swung hammers until his palms blistered. At night, he returned home with his shirt clinging to sweat, but his eyes alive in a way they had not been in years. He no longer poured whiskey to fill the silence. Instead, he drank tea Ruth Ann brewed, listening to her read by lamplight until his eyelids grew heavy. When the house was finished, it was no grand dwelling, yet every corner bore the mark of their love. On the porch, Garrett built a pinewood bench where Ruth Ann might strum her guitar in the evenings. In the kitchen, she set a small table, often scented with coffee and sweet bread. A shelf pressed against the wall held the worn books she'd carried from St. Louis, alongside volumes Garrett had bartered from passing peddlers. In the window, Ruth Ann planted wildflowers so that each dawn would spill color into the room. Anyone who stepped inside would notice one absence. There were no small shoes by the door, no cries of children echoing through the halls. Town gossip did not spare them. Without children, how can it be a true home? Yet Garrett and Ruth Ann measured their life by no one's rule but their own. Their roof rang with other sounds, guitar chords floating soft, boots knocking the floorboards, bursts of laughter when Garrett fumbled and toppled the stack of books she had just set in order. On late afternoons, Ruth Ann brewed coffee and read aloud from a novel, her voice weaving through the house while Garrett stretched on the bench, eyes closed, nodding as though every word seeped into bone. At mornings he stepped onto the porch to see her watering flowers. Sunlight tangled in her hair, and knew he no longer lived in the hollowed shell of a house he once called home. One evening, fire snapping in the hearth, Garrett set his hand over hers. "I once thought happiness meant a house full of children, the noise filling the emptiness," he said. "But now I know it's simpler. It's you here, whether in silence or in laughter. That's enough." Ruth Ann's eyes glimmered. "We don't need to live like anyone else, Garrett. We've built a roof that's ours, and, indeed, that roof grew to shelter more than just them." Roger Avery stopped by often, pipe smoke curling as he spun old stories. Dr. Bond came, declaring Ruth Ann's coffee strong enough to heal a weak heart. Children from town slipped in to hear her sing songs from the East, soft as lullabies. Their home, though without children of their own, brimmed with laughter, music, and a rare peace carved from the harsh frontier. Of course, not every day was flawless. Some mornings Garrett returned from the range reeking of sweat and dust, snapping about fences trampled by cattle. Some nights Ruth Ann sat long at the window, heavy with memories of the man she had buried years before. But unlike before, neither bore their burdens alone. Garrett would sit beside her, wordless, his palm steady on her back. Ruth Ann would brew a cup of coffee for him, and together they let the weight ease bit by bit until weariness softened. In time, Santa Fe Crossing learned its own acceptance. People saw them at the market, saw them on the church porch, saw them walking side by side. Not every glance was kind, but more and more heads tipped in greeting. What mattered most was clear. Two souls once cast adrift had found their belonging. One autumn evening, with wind cool across the plains, Ruth Ann sat on the porch, guitar resting on her knees. She plucked a soft tune as Garrett came out carrying two steaming cups. He handed one to her, then settled at her side, staring toward the distant hills. "Do you regret it?" he asked quietly. She turned her face to him. "Regret what?" "That we have no children." She held still a moment, then set the guitar aside and faced him square. "I feel the loss, yes, but I don't feel empty. I have you. I have this roof. We've shaped happiness our own way. Why should it need to look like anyone else's?" Garrett let out a breath, his lips curving in a tired but certain smile. He slipped his arm around her shoulders, drawing her against him. They sat in silence, listening to the wind, to the steady beat of each other's hearts. And they knew then, as surely as they had at the altar, that even without the clamor of children, their home was full. It was enough, it was whole. Time swept across the prairie like a restless wind. Years rolled on, and Santa Fe Crossing was no longer the lonely settlement where gossip could ruin a life. The dirt roads had been laid with gravel, the church porch freshly painted, new shops opened, and children flocked around the square like sparrows in spring. Through all those changes, the small house of Garrett Boone and Ruth Ann Moore still stood on its low rise, looking out across the fields. It was never the grandest house, no red shingles or carved pillars, but to the town it became a landmark. Folks gave it names: the House of Courage, the home of unconditional love. Its door was always open to the young who came seeking counsel. A newlywed couple once asked how to survive the sting of neighbors' whispers. A girl with tear-streaked cheeks came to hear Ruth Ann tell of the day she chose to stay beside Garrett, despite the jeers. A boy, awkward on the porch, asked Garrett how to love a woman when his kin disapproved, and each left with brighter eyes, with stronger hearts. Ruth Ann often sat at her kitchen table, pouring dark coffee, speaking in her steady voice. "Happiness never falls from the sky. It takes courage to hold tight to the hand beside you, even when the world turns its back." Garrett, fewer with words, would nod and sometimes share the story of his own ruin. "When I was left, I thought myself dead. I drowned in whiskey and smoke. But if I hadn't dared to open my heart again, I'd have grown old in silence. Now, I have Ruth Ann." He'd turned toward her then, his eyes lined with years, yet lit the same as when he first saw her. The town itself had shifted. Those who once mocked were gone, or else too worn to speak. When they saw Garrett and Ruth Ann walk hand in hand to church, they only tipped their hats. Children who once snickered grew into adults who now whispered to their own young, "That couple." They defied the world and proved love needs no wealth, only courage. Inside that house there was no echo of children's cries, but there was the record of a shared life. Shelves heavy with books, the old guitar still humming, the flower beds blooming season by season. Visitors could always find the smell of coffee, Garrett's low laugh, Ruth Ann's warm storytelling. They left behind no heirs of blood, but a larger inheritance, The belief that love belongs to those who choose it, not to those who judge it. One summer night they sat on the porch, the sky stretched black and jeweled with stars. The wind carried the scent of wild grass, the hum of crickets. They leaned close, hands entwined, silent in a peace words could not match. "If I regret anything," Garrett said softly, squeezing her hand, "it's not finding you sooner." Ruth Ann rested her head on his shoulder, smiling faintly. "No, Garrett. We came together in the only time that mattered, the moment we needed someone to see us." They lingered like that, watching the slow wheel of constellations. The lamplight from inside spilled onto the porch, casting the shadow of two souls who had outlasted gossip, grief, and fear. And as if speaking for all who might still be searching, Ruth Ann whispered, a truth distilled from a lifetime. Happiness isn't measured in children or riches. It's measured in the courage to stay, no matter what the world says. Garrett closed his eyes, nodding with quiet peace. Above them, a shooting star crossed the sky, bearing witness to a promise kept. Some love stories are not loud, nor marked by the cries of children, yet strong enough to change a whole town. The tale of Garrett Boone and Ruth Ann Moore was one such story. Two people who once believed themselves swallowed by darkness found each other, not to chase wealth or display their joy, but to prove that two hands clasped could withstand every doubting gaze, every cruel word, every buried fear. And in the twilight of life, when storms and years have weathered us, perhaps we all come to know this. Happiness cannot be weighed in possessions, nor in the expectations of others. It lives in the small moments, an eye that chooses to stay, a hand that refuses to let go, a porch where guitar strings, coffee steam, and steady love burn like a quiet fire through the seasons. This story leaves us with a gentle charge. True love need not be perfect, nor resemble another's. It asks only for courage, courage to open the heart, to forgive what has passed, to remain beside the one you've chosen despite the world's opinion. And when we look back over our lives, what will matter most are the hands we held, the tears we wiped away, more than wealth or praise. That, too, is the greatest legacy we can leave. A story of steadfastness, of choosing not to walk away. If this story touched your heart, I invite you to share in the comments. What do you believe is the greatest legacy of love you've witnessed or kept in your own life? Your words may be the comfort and courage for those still searching their way. Please leave a like if you found this story warming. Subscribe to join us on more journeys of Wild West love. And don't forget to comment so we can keep this circle of voices alive. For as Garrett and Ruth Ann proved, happiness needs little to survive. It needs only one thing: the courage to stay against the world.